Hello, my name is Jordan Bell, and this is my History of Education project on the colonial period. So first, I'm going to talk about the major historical events that happened during this time period. And the first thing I want to talk about is the Salem witch trials. Now, the Salem witch trials was probably one of the darkest chapters in our American history because during this time, individuals were accused and killed for practicing witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts. Another historical event was the Great Awakening, and this happened during the 1730s and 40s. And this was basically a religious awakening, and it emphasized a direct and personal relationship with God, leading to a new kind of formation of religious influences and on the American cultural and politics. And another big historical event that happened was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this was more just a Puritan settlement in present day Massachusetts, and it's known as it's New England. It was the center of a New England settlement, and it shaped the religious and social fabric of this region at this time. And another historical event was the passing of the Old Deluder-Satan Act in 1647. And this also took place in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it basically required any town with over 50 households to establish some sort of grammar school. This way, it could ensure that children could read, and more specifically, read the Bible. And that is since religion was very pushed on children at the time and in education, that's why. And then the opening of Yale and Harvard. So the founding of these Ivy League schools was a very monumental moment, and it still to this day remains the oldest and the most prestigious in the United States. And it can really reflect on how committed these people were to learning or having a higher education in the American colonies. So, who could teach during this time period? I think to explain that, I need to explain the types of schools that were available to students. Now, first is the dame schools. These were more informal private schools led by widows or housewives, but they were really respected women overall because these women were really dedicated to their role in providing a basic education for children. And the children did learn how to read and write, which is all really any child could ask for at that time. And then there was Latin grammar schools, and this was mostly taught with men, with an educational background that focused on classical education, such as teaching them Latin and Greek languages and just classical literature. They were preparing these students to further pursue their academic career, and usually students who were in these kind of schools had the means and the money to pursue a higher education. So, private tutors. Private tutors were hired by very wealthy families during this time period. These tutors were individuals who specialized in specific knowledges. Um, they had a range of subjects they could teach, and they played a significant role in educating the upper class children. And then there's the university professors, once again taught by men. But university professors were highly respected and educated scholars who taught institutions in these for higher education. They were experts in subjects such as philosophy and natural philosophy, which was a big thing during this time period, and their teachings really did lay the groundwork for advanced learning. So who could be a student? So I'm just gonna start out with boys. Boys had the most widespread access to any formal education than anyone else. They could attend various types of schools, including the dame schools, the Latin grammar schools, and or receive private tutoring. Education was definitely a priority with boys growing up. However, girls were not so lucky. Girls were faced with more limited opportunities when it came to a formal education. They did receive basic instruction such as reading and writing, but in the society eyes during that time, girls were often centered around or expected to take on the domestic roles and responsibilities inside the house. And then there's wealthy children. Wealthy children tended to attend much formal or more formal education. They might attend Latin schools or receive private tutoring. This provided them with more of a comprehensive and specialized education. And it also tailors to their status because obviously many people cared about their status and what people thought of them. So if you were wealthy, it was expected that your children were given the same amount of, or given the best education they possibly could. And then there are poor children. So there were way more children who did not have the funds or particularly were in the right area for schools, such as rural areas or less developed areas. And they did not receive such a formal education as other students may have, but they did receive a basic education, just such as learning to read and numbers, learning numbers, counting numbers. And then, unfortunately, enslaved African American children had extremely limited access, if not any at all. Education was always denied to them, and nobody during this time thought that African American children deserved an education. So, the content that was taught throughout this time, first, there is the basic literacy, and that it means exactly how it sounds. You just learn the basic skills of reading and writing, which everybody needs that skill set if you want to move or continue on in life. And then there was more of the religious instruction. And this was more because religion was played a significant role in our education during this time period. It was basically a requirement that students learn to read and understand the Bible. And it was kind of considered an essential moral factor into the development. And then in the Latin and Greek schools, these are more advanced schooling. So they learn a variety of information, such as languages in Greek and in Latin. And they also learn a more persuasive way of speaking and writing skills. And then there is classical literature, and this usually takes place in the university setting. Um, just like in the universities like Harvard and Yale, students were exposed to classical literature such as philosophy work, and this higher level education prepared them for careers in philosophy or any other scholarly job they could find. So the rationale for the content taught, meaning what was the reasoning for everything that was taught to be taught. Now, like I said earlier, religious played a huge role in shaping the education during this colonial period. The curriculum was very heavily influenced um, by religious text and religious meanings. And then there's practical skills and trades were valued. Now, these skills and trades were mostly people who didn't have access to formal education went down this route. That way, they could still be self-sufficient for themselves and in their communities. And then the moral and ethical values. The goal with teachers is they wanted to install moral and ethics onto students. They wanted to prepare them to be responsible and walking examples of a good citizen in society. And all just the content that was taught during this time, the values, it all aligned with the societal values on what everything was expected with your status and your societal status. How this content was taught, it's still pretty similar to how we learn today, just minus the technology part, obviously. Like memorization was a huge method used when it came to teaching students. They often had to memorize passages from books, including the Bible, by memory, and then they would have to, let's say, write it down or speak it in front of the class. And then there's oral instructions. Now, this is just when the teacher is basically lecturing the students, and the students are expected to listen and absorb the information through the learning or take notes or just what they need to do. And then there was the copying of passages and textbooks, which, their textbooks were very different from ours. They were more just books that they had at the time, or the Bible um, paragraphs that they had to write down. They use this to practice your handwriting. You would have to pick a passage, you'd have to write it down, and then it would reinforce your reading skills as well. And then there's the classic teacher center approach. And this was when obviously the teacher is the authority figure of the classroom and they are responsible for teaching the knowledge and instruction to the students. And lastly, I want to talk about the discipline that went on during this time period. If by any reason there were students who did misbehave or failed to meet the expectations in these classrooms, they were faced with physical discipline. So if basically you were there to learn and nothing else. And so finally, the impact of the colonial period. So the emphasis on the basic literacy skills during this period really allowed uh, the focus of a more modern education that we have today because it was so important to learn reading and writing. Obviously, that has carried out with us for the past hundreds of years, and we still to this day know how important it is to at least know how to read and write. And then the founding of the Ivy schools. The establishment of the Ivy Leagues, such as Harvard and Yale during this time period, made a significant milestone in American education as a whole. These prestigious universities still continue to be very influential, and still some of the most respected institutions in the United States. And then the emphasis of classical education during this time period really had a lasting impact on the structure and the curriculum of our modern day education. The influence of classical languages can still be observed in early higher education that we have today. And then just the influence of philosophy in education. The philosophy in education really did contribute to the development of our modern educational theories and practices. Um, the legacy of early educational philosophies can still be seen in approaches today.